we want to provide a synopsis of the story that was published in Chebacco, but then depart from that very quickly and get you involved in the conversation and talk about the way we learn about history of a place. To begin, just to see who's in the audience, what they know, who has read the article in Chebacco, the Journal of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society? Only, I would get, I saw, 5 or 6 hands go up in an audience of about 50, I think. So that's good. That's, I would say, approximately 45 potential new members of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. I don't think we have that many copies, but Lisa can fix you up. And to start the conversation, let's just do a quick synopsis of the story of the Harry A. Berwind and her crew. In October 1905, October 10th, 1905, the Berwind, a 4-masted schooner, was discovered about 30 miles off the coast of Cape Fear in North Carolina. A red light was hanging from its rigging, a signal of distress, and another ship, the Blanche King, approached her and communicated with men on board the Berwind. And one of them shouted from the rail that they needed assistance, that one man among them had killed members of the crew, and they needed to be taken off the ship. It turns out, very complicated turn of events, but I'll get to the end of this one aspect of the story. There were 8 men in the crew of the Berwind, 4 officers and 4 crewmen. The 4 officers were all white men. The 4 crewmen were all black men. And of the survivors, only 3 black men remained alive. One black man was found on top of a cabin on the deck. He was dead. And scenes throughout the ship revealed where scenes of violence had occurred, where pools of blood. Apparently, all the officers had been killed and thrown overboard. As the world encountered the Berwind, you can see that the forward topmast was missing. The hull was leaking. The rudder was broken. The ship had gone through a great deal of distress. And the story that unwinds was that the Berwind departed Philadelphia in July 1905, and it went to Cardenas, Cuba, with a load of coal. And from Cardenas, had gone on to Mobile, Alabama, to pick up a load of lumber, and then proceeded around Florida and encountered a storm off the coast of Florida when all that damage occurred. And it was revealed that the storm was not only meteorological, but there was a tremendous amount of conflict and violence on board the vessel, even before the murders occurred. That the men were required to work through tremendous heat, with terrible food, interpersonal interactions that were truly a miserable environment. It was not a happy ship. And what transpired was that one of the men of the crew had lost it. It was said that a pot of bad coffee was the final straw, and he murdered the captain, Captain Edwin Rumill, who was from Pretty Marsh on Mount Desert Island. And I'll point out, Gail Reber is with us today. Gail is Captain Rummell's granddaughter and the source of much of the information we've received. Initially, the 3 surviving men, Edwin, Robert Sawyer, Arthur Adams, and Henry Scott, survived. And they Henry Scott accused Sawyer and Adams of participating in a mutiny. As it was revealed that actually Henry Scott was the sole murderer, and Adams and Sawyer were accused of the crime. All three were tried together, all three were found guilty, and all three sentenced to hang. While they were awaiting their sentence to be carried out, Henry Scott exonerated, or confessed that he was the sole murderer. He exonerated his crewmates, Sawyer and Adams. And while he was put to death, he was hung. Sawyer and Adams' case was appealed all the way through the court system to the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, because he wanted to protect his political position with his Southern influencers, did not want to do anything too overt that would be favorable towards these two Black men, and merely commuted their sentence from death to life in prison. And that's where, that's Henry Scott on the left, and Arthur Adams on the top, and Robert Sawyer on the bottom. Their sentences were commuted to life in prison in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where they went in 1906. And did I miss something?
No.
No. And then at some point during their imprisonment, Arthur Adams encountered a story in the New York Times that told of a popular Broadway actor named H.B. Warner. He was a matinee star of the day, and he was interested in what today we would call an innocence project. His desire was to help men who had been sentenced to life in prison, and if possible, set them free. Now, you maybe think you never heard of H.B. Warner before, but actually you have. He's the guy in late in life who played the pharmacist in It's a Wonderful Life, the guy who slaps young Jimmy Stewart in the ear. But H.B. Warner was quite a handsome man and a matinee idol. And here he's pictured backstage at San Quentin, where he was performing for prisoners. And Henry Scott became aware of the plight of Sawyer and Adams, and sent his lawyer in the middle, Joseph Bueller, to investigate, to see if they had been wrongly convicted. And Bueller became convinced that they had. He found that the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury all agreed that these guys were innocent. And based on his 18 months of labor going back and forth to North Carolina and New York, got another petition in front of now Howard Taft, the new president of the United States, and the Pardon Board. And Taft likewise had to be careful in his mind about Southern sympathies, but arranged for their prison sentence to be reduced to time served. And Arthur Adams and Robert Sawyer were both set free. Robert Sawyer, pictured on the right, served as a valet for H.B. Warner, and Adams served as a legal assistant for Joseph Bueller. Now, there's a lot more to be said about the story, and I think we'll dig into it, but I think one of the themes of the story that appears in Chebacco is the difficulty that Adams and Sawyer had in dealing with the Southern legal system in the Jim Crow South, where their very survival was at risk because they were in danger of being lynched. Only 6 weeks before, in a nearby town, a Black man had been lynched. The newspapers of the day were full of racially violent language that was commonplace. The one newspaper, the name of the newspaper was The Caucasian, and on its masthead it said, "White supremacy forever." This is in the newspaper you buy on the corner every day. And even as kind of prepared for this, I guess, as a white kid from New Jersey, unprepared, but thinking maybe I was kind of prepared for this. It's rather shocking to encounter in the newspapers of the day the level of racial language that was prevalent throughout the community. I think I'll stop there. We'll probably fill in edges along the way because, as you'll see, there's a lot more to the story. But I think the first thing we want to talk about is how Jaylene and I each encountered the story. And in turning over to Jaylene, I want to say that Jaylene was one of my predecessors. Both of us have been executive directors of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. And we've left those roles and moved on to other things. But to me, this whole study has sort of been reintroducing me to the work that Jaylene did, including serving as the first executive director of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, on her watch establishing an endowment, acquiring the Sound Schoolhouse, which is now the headquarters of the Historical Society and the place where all our archives are kept, initiating a program that today we call Vintage Classroom, that is going on now 20-some years later, where area school kids experience life in a school classroom. And not only that, she also left me a pile of material this high that I used as the basis for my research of this story. So I'd like to invite Jaylene to tell us how she first encountered this story.
Thank you, Tim. And Tim and the people who came after me, I can't be more thrilled, because all of the things that we had hoped would happen when we started to build the institution continued to grow and grow and grow. And I think it's definitely going to survive many, many years and tell many stories. We're starting to talk about how we encountered the story because Tim had said something, which we'll talk about in a minute, that really surprised me when he gave his Chebacco chat. And we'll get to that. But that just got us talking about how we encountered this story and why that makes a difference. So I grew up on MDI. And I come from a long line of storytellers, and I loved listening to stories of local people growing up. So the fact that there was someone who is a sea captain that was killed in a mutiny wasn't news to me, but it wasn't really all that important either. Ralph Stanley, whom many of you may know, or was also a storyteller and a president of the MDI Historical Society at one point. He always told this story about, there were 5 Captain Rumills, all in the same, no, sorry, I've done it all right. Okay, there were 5 schooners in a port all in one day, and all of them captained by a Captain Rumill. And one of them was killed in mutiny. Okay. And so I think that was just part of the local knowledge. And this understanding about the Rumills was part of the local knowledge. And then, Gail, who I knew also through the Historical Society, was talking to me about this story and how much, that she had done some research into it as well. And really, and also I think they had put a little exhibit together of all of his things back in 1989 right here at the library. And, but she really wanted somebody who could do the research and spend the time and really dig deeper into this and go beyond the person who was killed in a mutiny. She wanted to know a man she'd never met before in a very different way than the sea captain who was killed in a mutiny. And she wanted to know this grandfather who loved his wife and his children and went out every day to work and, bringing coal and lumber and guano up and down the coasts of the United States and also around the world. Who was this person? And so that was a story I definitely wanted to tell as well. And so I wrote the biography of Ed Rumill for Gail and her family so that they could understand who he was a little better. So that's how I came to this. Yes, we told the story of the mutiny, but that wasn't what I was after at that time. So I'm very grateful to Gail for opening up to me and letting me use everything that the family had kept all those years, and really also being very vulnerable to let somebody else come into your family and really dig in and tell that kind of a story. And because by doing this, she gave an opportunity for future historians to look again at the mutiny and really tell a very important story about race relations in maritime history. So I'm very grateful to her for letting us tell that really hard history and ask those very hard and necessary questions about race relations in maritime history. And that's a very difficult thing to talk about when it's your grandfather who was part of that story. So thank you so much for allowing us to do that and to be here. And so Tim's going to tell you, how he encountered the story, which is very different than how I did.
So what Jaylene has done is, in the nicest way possible, contradict what Lisa read you from my story, that this is an unknown story, that, how come nobody talks about it? Well, she knew all about it. And it's a matter of my perspective of not just being aware. I had first encountered the barest bit of this story because of an artifact that is in the collection of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. It's an instrument called a taffrail log. It's hung over the back of a ship and dragged through the water, and it acts as an odometer to see how far the ship has traveled. And it said it belonged to Captain Rumill. And my memory, which I can't reproduce by the records I explore now, but my memory was that it said something about a mutiny that occurred on Somme Sound. And I had made it my business in writing articles for Chebacco. By the way, Chebacco, that peculiar name, is the name of one of the most common working boats of the 18th century, 18th and 19th century. So that's where that name comes from. But we would publish every year a story, and I would look for stories that weren't quite true, like a artifact known as the Norwood Cove object, looked kind of like a dagger, was thought to be a relic of the 1613 Jesuit mission on Mount Desert Island, actually turned out to be a boat art that a soldier brought back from France and gave to the library, and it's been contained and hung on the wall in a hand-carved frame. Or a inscription at seawall was not the record of a child lost at sea, as was commonly understood, but instead was graffiti left by a lovelorn pastor who was moving on from his mission on Mount Desert Island. And so I was sort of in a mode of looking for stories that maybe were apocryphal. And I put this as possibly in that category. And when Rainey Bench, the current executive director of the Historical Society, invited me to write a story for Chebacco and told me the theme was maritime history, I suggested this one to be explored. And I think the first person I called was Gail to see if she could fill me in. And she told me that Jaylene had written a biography of her grandfather. And not only that, Jaylene had a stack of materials, no kidding, this high, of original or copies of the archival documents that served as the basis for this article. Materials from court proceedings, pardon board, the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, correspondence between the inmates and the King of England, asking them, the king, to intervene on their behalf with the President of the United States. There was just an endless supply of primary source material that I used to write this article. So I very quickly found that, no, this story is not unknown. It's well known, but it just depends on who you ask. If you're someone who had 5 generations living on this island, or a kid from New Jersey who showed up in 2010, yeah, you might not know about this. But it still remains, how come this story isn't told like the fire of 47? Or the Jesuits at Saint-Sauveur? Why isn't it in the tourist literature? How come we don't know about it? So I think that's a starting point for a discussion that we want to engage you in.
And that's that was the question. So Tim had asked on in this Chebacco chat, why has this story not been part of MDI's shared history? And I think you said that it was actually Willie Granston who asked that question, who, when I was the director of the MDI Historical Society, was, I think, volunteering at the Great Harbor Maritime Museum at that time. And why did it not become part of MDI shared history? Well, the simple answer is because it's not MDI history, it's North Carolina history. I mean, that's why. And this was, yes, as a local person, and local people knew that story, and that's why it wasn't told. Can we go back to the way back, I think. So we didn't title this, a lecture about, the mutiny of the Berwind. We wanted to get beyond the headlines, right? And we wanted to kind of look at how identity shapes the way we came to understand this story. So I understand this story, Gail understands the story in a very different way than Tim understands this story. And as I was writing the biography, what she was really looking for was to know her grandfather, who she did not know. Well, I didn't either. Now, Gail, you knew you knew Letty, did you not? You knew your grandmother. You knew Letty.
Yes.
Yes. And
but not my grandfather.
But not her grandfather.
My mother didn't know. Really,
Right.
because he was gone.
Her mother,
See all the time.
her uncle didn't know these people, but she knew her grandmother. I didn't. So I'm looking at this in a very different way than even Gail is. And as I'm writing this story, well, this is very interesting, the story of the sea captain, but Letty keeps capturing my attention. I want to know what the story of Letty is. Letty is Ed Rummill's wife, and she's at home raising 2 children while he's at sea. And what did we figure? I was 18 months, maybe, that he was at home total.
In 30 years.
In 30 years.
Wow.
Ed Rummel, Letty did this, raised those children by herself. And so me, as someone who studied women's history, was immediately drawn to that. And that was the story that I was going to tell Gail's story. Absolutely. But I needed to understand Letty. And so my identity as a woman really shaped the way that I told this story. And then, as the story of the mutiny comes into this and unfolds, I knew the story of the mutiny not well at all, just that he was killed. And then I come to understand that there are 4 white officers and 4 Black crew. And that's the first time I knew that. Well, the way I start asking questions when I'm writing this just changed. So whose story didn't get told? So we have the Black crew. I don't know what their story is. Why did this happen? I don't know the stories of the cook and the first mate. We don't know those stories. What about there, did Arthur Adams and Robert Sawyer, what about their descendants? What story could they be telling us? We don't know, because we don't know where they are. But they're certainly going to look at it in a very different way. So what do you think? Tim, how does our identity shape how we look at this story?
Well, one of the first articles, as I did an article search on this story, I encountered an article written for the North Carolina Historical Review. Can we get to that slide?
Which slide do you want to see?
Van Newkirk.
Must be, I don't know.
There you go. So there was the man pictured here is Van Newkirk Sr., PhD. He's a historian who in 2014 wrote an article titled "Washed Down in Blood, Murder on the Schooner Harry A. Berwind." And it really draws out the racial injustice aspect of this, how difficult it was to be a Black man in the justice system of the Jim Crow South. And I really have followed his lead and credited him with that insight. But I recently corresponded with him. He is currently the president of Wilberforce University in Ohio. Wilberforce University is a historically Black college based in Ohio. He was previously the president of Fisk University in Nashville, which was a site of much of the leadership of the civil rights movement. And Dr. Newkirk told me that he encountered this story when he was a child growing up in East Carolina. He can't be sure, but he thinks he might have learned it from his grandfather, who had relatives in Wilmington where the trial took place, and would hear of it. And it only leaves us to imagine what his perspective of this story was, how he encountered this, how this story might have been told to him in childhood. And when he had the opportunity, many years later, he has the opportunity to pursue it as a historian and put in really a definitive perspective on the murder and on the Berwind and what happened in its aftermath.
Yeah. So really, here we are. Tim thinking, well, wow, this is so fascinating. Why hasn't anybody told this story? But in fact, here on the island, people were remembering that story. And then in North Carolina, we don't even realize that we have this man also who had heard, kind of like me. I grew up hearing the story. He grew up hearing that story. So these identities really matter when we come to look at this story. Now, why wasn't this story told more on MDI? Well, it's not a pleasant story either. And I'm not sure that the family necessarily wanted to continue to be reminded of this over and over again. And, one of the things that Tim and I talked about was how the story developed over time is really important to think about. Tim had you had brought up historiography. Historiography, the history of history. So we started looking at that history of this history.
So the initial headlines that went out on this story, and it was national news, were lurid stories, and often racially charged, as we see in the sub-headline, 3 Negroes captured in control of the Harry A. Berwind. And often that was the headline or the sub-headline, that it was determined from the very start that this was a race mutiny. Turned out to be something different. They were referred to as the mutineers, and that was their story, sort of locked in the popular press of the day. And then we see this storyline takes a ride through many different media, from novels to film. We have some
So
of those.
it changes over time, and I just want to pause for a minute and look at some of these other headlines. We see again that while we have this type of headline, story of bloodshed, Berwind Mutiny horror, trials of mutineers, but like Tim says, 3 Negroes captured, and then wholesale slaughter of white members of crew. It's Adam Sawyer Negroes charge is very important, to these stories at that time, that race is a part of this. Okay, but yeah, as time goes on, so this is a year after, and then now it's just a story. Okay, it's no longer these gruesome headlines. A little later, we do get some good news for the 2 sailors who were acquitted.
But for those who can't see so well, that was the New York Times, and its focus, its angle on the story was the what is that? Mensch ex machina. These great guys come out of the sky to rescue these poor men. H.B. Warner and Joseph Bueller move heaven and earth to free these men from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and sort of 6 years later retells the story of the Berwind and the freedom for these guys.
1930s detective stories, true crime becomes very popular, and here the story resurfaces again and makes it into this true crime magazine, and it's not I can't find my copy of it anywhere, but I have read it. Gail, do you have a copy of this story? Do you remember? Do you have a copy of this story from the True Detective Mysteries? Yeah, I can't find my copy of it anywhere, but it's very loosely told. There's a lot missing from it. And then this is not actually, I can't find a copy of the book anyway. But sometime between 1935 and 1958, this book, Infamy at Sea, was written. I wish I could see it. I don't know. I'm sure it was very loosely based on the crime. Yes.
Who killed who? We have a black man that's been killed, and then we have 4 white men that have been killed. Who was killed and who?
Sorry, I raced through the synopsis,
That
but
story,
it's a good question.
I will.
Henry Scott was convicted as the murderer, confessed murderer, and widely accepted by the court system and witnesses as the man who actually did the killing.
The killing of the white man and the black man?
Yes.
So he killed 5 people.
Yes, in total. First, he killed the 4 white officers and threw them overboard. And then Henry Scott and 3 crewmen remained. The 3 crewmen tried to subdue Henry Scott and tie him up and hold him prisoner. But in the struggle, Henry Scott shot one of the black crewmen, and that's the man whose body they found on the deck. So that left now only Henry Scott finally subdued and bound up, and Sawyer and Adams. Okay, Bernice?
So you have 4 white officers, 4 blacks. Did the officers do any manual work? What were they doing? 4 officers, 4.
So first mate, so you have a captain of the ship.
Then I understand.
A first mate in shifts will take on other operational duties. And remember, this is an enormous ship.
Okay.
It's 200 feet long and has 4 masts. I think it's 30 feet wide. So it takes 3/4 of most of a football field, 2/3 of a football field. It's a very large vessel that requires a lot of people to run it. So you have an engineer, so you have the captain and the first mate who are responsible for the vessel, probably in shifts, where they're handing off overall responsibility. You have an engineer who's responsible for the mechanical systems on board and any sorts of things that can go wrong with a big, complicated wooden sailing vessel, and you have a cook who, by all accounts, was not very good at his job. Was operating under dire circumstances, and following the storm off the coast of Florida, it was said the food was much worse than usual.
I think
Okay.
this might be a good time to talk about conditions on the ship. And typically, the rule of thumb was 2 crew per mast. So 2 men, not necessarily crew, but 2 per mast. So that's why they had 8 men, because it was a 4-mastage. Yeah.
You had 3 convicted of mutiny. Who testified? If they were the only 3, did they all testify against themselves? A. B. Were these guys all quite educated when they wrote all these petitions like the King of England, etc.?
So Sawyer and Adams declared their innocence from the beginning and told a consistent story from the beginning to the very end in their freedom, that Henry Scott had perpetrated the murders. Henry Scott accused Sawyer and Adams and Coakley, the guy found on the deck, of orchestrating the murder, and he tried to stop them, and that's why he shot Coakley. So he had a story that contradicted theirs. Based on the weight of the evidence, the two men testifying against the one, Scott was regarded as the ringleader, and he was tried first, followed by Sawyer and Adams. I don't know, based on maybe the believability of their testimony, the weight started to shift against Adams. Also, looking at the evidence on deck, the trajectory of a bullet that killed Coakley better fit a story of a man lying on deck attempting to be tied down and a man over him than a man like shooting straight on. So there was some physical evidence that implicated Scott. Nevertheless, they were all convicted together, probably for some of the reasons you cite, that it's a little difficult when it's all he said, but that's how it played out. And then eventually the story swung in favor of Sawyer and Adams based on Scott's confession that he delivered while he was awaiting his death sentence and didn't waver from. That was signed confession. He read it out while he was standing on the scaffold.
Was the cook among the dead?
Yes.
So it was justifiable, honest.
I think there's some coffee drinkers in the audience who would say that. I think there's enough time has passed for us to make light of it. And I don't mean to, but it was just a dreadful circumstance and the conditions. They left Philadelphia in July. Anybody here from Philadelphia? That's amazing. Philadelphia, really hot in July, and then going to Cuba and Alabama, just dreadfully hot conditions. There was a lot of documentation of harsh words among the crew. Henry Scott threatened the cook with, I think, knocking him down and wiping the deck with him. There were a lot of beans thrown around. There was a steady diet of beans, and there was something in their contract that an excessive amount of beans should not be fed to the crew, yet it was. And they weren't very good beans either, not like the MDI Historical Society annual bean supper. They were poor quality. And they were made to work in the hot sun. In his confession, Henry Scott said that the reason he committed the murders was because he was deprived of food and water and made to work in the heat an excessive amount, and that put him over the edge. And then as to your question about their level of education, we know for sure that Arthur Adams could write a good letter. He could write an articulate letter to the King of England, serve as a legal assistant to Joseph Bueller. I don't know about Robert Sawyer's level of education. I don't know the answer to that.
We don't know. We do know that he, he defended himself very well. I mean, he communicated very, very well. And, it was stated over and over, how intelligent, how very bright he was. So, again, we really don't know very much about him at all. We do know, that Henry Scott had appeared in the logbook several times throughout this trip. And the question always for me was, why didn't Captain Rumill put him off the ship? Because they arrived in Cuba, and he'd already been logged for insubordinance. And one of the reasons is, I believe, is that you cannot put a sailor on shore in a foreign country and leave them there. I think they would have had to have law enforcement get involved. And I think Ed Rumill just didn't want to do that at that time. And it would have left him short of crew. It would have been a very difficult thing for him to do. And then they make it to Alabama? Mobile, Alabama. And again, Scott was late. So Rumill was ready to pull away from the dock, and Scott wasn't there. There was his chance. He was back in the United States. They could have left him right there and then, but they didn't. He waited for him to come back. So that tells you something about how much he must have needed that help.
Well, think about what the job advertisement would be,
Right.
What the wages were poor, the work conditions were terrible, hard. And I guess one point I left out of the synopsis is that the crew spent this anger, was set to boil out of Philadelphia into Cuba and over to Mobile. And it was in Mobile that we believe that Henry Scott acquired 2 pistols. And the presence of a firearm on the boat, in addition to the level of hostility among the crew, probably, cinched the fate.
Where did the trial take place?
In Wilmington, North Carolina.
You've had your hand up for quite a while.
Yeah. We assume that the white crew and the white officers and the black crew would be fairly common in ships like this, at that time. You have, more reports about any suggestions of trouble like this?
Well, you're typical. I had the same kind of question. Was it very typical to have an all black crew on these boats?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a segregated society at sea and ashore. So it was very common to have white officers, black crew members. And one of the things I touch on in the story is the role of race in the merchant marine of the day and on Mount Desert Island. Augustus Savage grew up at Astaku, just up the cove. And we have his records, correspondence between Augustus and his wife, Emily Savage, that are very revealing. He wrote in his memoir that he took a trip in 1854 to Jacksonville, Florida, and he wrote back to his, I guess he wasn't married then, he wrote back to his family, all I see are blacks. And this is from very white Mount Desert Island. It was a rare episode. Maybe you could count on one hand in the census how many black people were present on the island at the time.
And Ed Rumill also makes observations. One of the letters that he wrote from North Carolina before he had married Letty, he observed that all of our sailors are deeply tanned and you can't wash them white, was his comment. Yes.
I have a question from somebody online. Let's get to it. Here we go. Do you know who owned the ship, and was Rumill the only person from MDI on the vessel?
Yes, he was the only person from MDI on the vessel, and I don't have the name of the owner right, but it was owned by multiple. Most ships were owned in shares because it was too risky to own, for one owner. Because shipwrecks happened all the time. And in Rummell's case, 4.
Ugh.
He lost 4 ships. And that seems, and this was a matter of great concern, and I really think he was depressed, but that was not uncommon. So I don't have that right off the top of my head, but if you're interested in knowing, I definitely can pull that information out for you.
And Harry A. Berwind, by the way, was a coal mining executive. So that's why the ship was named Harry A. Berwind. But likewise, I don't have the name of the owner.
The ship was built in Maine. It was built in Machias, right?
Millbridge.
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 So we know from, Savage's comment, we know from Rummell's comment, and just from, the studies that have been done, that yes, most of these, crew were Black at that time. And, we have to remember when this is. So we're looking at 40 years, 1905 is 40 years after the Civil War. And this is an opportunity. Hopefully an opportunity for slightly better pay. And to see something else, to get out of this country or just to get into different communities. So it was definitely something that was possibly a good opportunity for them. But the history of treatment of all sailors was brutal. And that included Ed Rummell when he was a young sailor as well. They were treated brutally, and that was just expected. And Ed himself did write about, he hit the cook today, and this was in an earlier sail, that the cook was saucy and he punched him.
I think though, it wasn't just Black crew that were treated badly, any of them on these boats were not treated very well.
Yeah, I think everybody was treated poorly. Another story from Savage, Augustus Savage, was he served on a federal vessel at the mouth of the James River in the Civil War. And it seemed at the time that there was more conflict within the crew of his vessel than there were against the Confederates. He said that half the crew was Black, maybe 20% were Irish, and he was in a minority. At that time, I think the Irish would have been considered sort of in the same category as Black men. Yeah. And also, as Jaylene said, there was the conditions for sailors of all kinds were abominable, barely better than prison. In fact, an 1873 government report said as much, that conditions on American merchant ships is worse than any prison, or are as bad as any prison.
And Ed Rummell himself was not a stranger to that. He talks about not being fed well. Ed Rummell lived through a changing age of maritime history. He starts out in square rigged ships, shifts to schooners, and then later in his career, although he didn't really want to, ends up on a steamship. And when he's on the Nero shipping a second mate, he actually kept his diary in code, which I had to decode. And he writes about the terrible food that he's being served, and he's on a starvation diet. Yet later, if you look at his own words, his logbooks and his diary about treatment of the crew, he's saying the same exact thing. He can't afford to feed these guys. They're eating too much. One of the things that Scott accuses Rummell of is selling some of the food from the Berwind in Cuba. And he probably did, because he had written that in his own diaries in the past, that he had in fact taken things off his vessels and sold them in Cuba to do things like hire a pilot to get them out of the harbor. So that doesn't surprise me at all. In terms of, the treatment of these sailors who were Black, we do know from the trial records that there were a lot of racial words thrown around on the ship, that they were calling each other, referring to each other by their race. And accusing each other of doing certain things based on their race. So the cook was accusing them of doing certain things because they were Black. They were accusing the officers of doing certain things because they were white. So there certainly were racial tensions, absolutely. And this is 40 years after the Civil War, and what we don't know to what extent is racial trauma, and again, I'm talking about the stories we don't know, to what extent does racial trauma play into what happened with Scott and with Rumill, and this does not work out well for either one of them.
And I guess something we haven't said is that both Scott and Sawyer, Arthur Adams and Robert Sawyer were not American citizens. They were of the British West Indies, thus the letter to the King of England. Okay, that must have seemed random. Sorry. And also a word back on the episode that Jaylene reported of violence between Captain Rumill and the cook. The next day he reported that he was violently ill. He thought the cook had poisoned him.
Yes.
So there was
Yes.
back and forth.
Right. Right.
Don't
Yes,
mess with
the
the cook.
logbook says that the suspected that the cook poisoned the captain. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi,
Hey, Will.
really enjoying the give and take here. Great story. I'm curious as to where this ratio of 2 men per mast comes from.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know.
Because, the labor aboard the ship isn't evenly divided among 8 men.
No, it's not.
Certainly.
You're
Got
absolutely,
1 man per mast.
you're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
And even though they've got a schooner rig instead of the old
Right.
4-mast the square slope rig, you don't have all this running up and down around it's getting things that are complicated above too, but still that seems like awfully small crew. And I wonder, does that lend any sense of challenging the credibility of the story?
Oh.
You mean the 2 men per mast story?
Well, why was the crew so small?
Well, it sounds like he had difficulty recruiting people, right? He took Henry Scott on board.
He did. It was always difficult to recruit people, without a doubt. But I think the crew was so small because they're going to spend as little as they possibly can on labor. These schooners are going out. They're on their way out. These are very old ships as a rule. The cargoes they're carrying are guano. Okay, nobody wanted to carry guano. They're carrying coal. Coal was a miserable cargo to carry. Lumber, they stacked those decks as high as they possibly could to the point where the gunnels were just practically below water. And this is not what the steamships are carrying. They're trying to get every last mile out of those old schooners that they possibly can. And in order to do that, and in order to make any money off these ships, because these are not valuable cargoes, well, they are, but not like the steamships are carrying at this point. You've got to cut your labor costs as much as you possibly can. And there you've also got, and certainly Captain Rummel has an interest in this ship. Generally, it would be very unusual for a captain to go aboard and not have an actual financial interest in the ship. The owner, the primary owner doesn't want a captain who doesn't have a financial interest in the ship, because it's more likely that that captain is not going, that is not going to take as good care. And so it's also in Rummel's interest to be very cautious about the food. So it's quite possible that they were on short rations. But like Tim said, you talked about their contract. I'm not sure, what kind of contract they had, but the government, the United States government only recently had passed laws, even just a few years before, what you needed to feed a crew member, and it was posted in the galley exactly what they were due to have. And Henry Scott wanted to have what was his due, and he was not getting it.
I wonder if we could maybe tie up some other ends of the story. The Berwind met its end about a year later. It sank off the coast of Cuba. So it was, the headline there was "Bad Luck Ship. Never saw a lucky day in its life." And Jaylene, I wonder if you could start to talk about what happened to Letty and his wife, Captain Rummel's wife, and his children, George and Edna.
And are these the Rummels of Rummel Road?
Yes, in Tremont, or in like Seal Cove. Yes, they are.
Yes, sir.
Before you go on, it was the mug shots. Were there guns being held on there?
No. We often get asked that. Those are, I guess it's a very, talking about mugshots tonight. There was a process where they were sat in a chair. You had to have a straight on view and then a profile view. And there was a bit of iron where you had to rest your head. So I think it's like I don't think the technology was necessary in 1905, but some of those early daguerreotypes, they had some sort of frame to keep your head still.
Yeah, and not just prisoners, I mean, anybody. So if you look at old photos, there's, and I'm not sure, I guess somebody was probably just holding that, but there was an actual sort of, I don't know, little collar they put around the back of their neck to hold their heads perfectly still. So if you go back and look at any of the old photos from that time, you'll notice they're sitting quite straight, ramrod straight, and holding their heads just like that, because they have that behind their necks. Because if they move at all, it's gonna be blurry.
One of the things that was, they were incredibly responsive at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary archives, because there's a lot of men who were wrongly convicted and sentenced to prison, and now their families are trying to understand what became of them. So they provided these high resolution images, and they're really terrific portraits, right? I mean, terrible circumstances, but amazing photographs.
Yeah, I'll go to Letty, but I just want to run through this quickly. Just, we talked about how the story changed. We get to 1958, we have a movie that is totally, it just has nothing to do with this story, but they do, this is supposed to be based on the Berwind Mutiny. And then, so here, it starts to change again. I think here in 1989, Gail and her family felt, it's time to share this. This starts to pique curiosity. There's an article in Downey's magazine. Then I come along, Gail and I get together and I start writing. And then lo and behold, Van Newkirk writes an article, and then we have podcasts, and now we have this legal history book about what happened as well. So
a peculiar thing about Van Newkirk's article in the historical review was that he shows a picture of Henry Scott, And he credits Jaylene
Yes, we're
Roths,
very curious about that.
Captain Rummell's biographer, as the source of the photograph.
We're very curious.
And we don't know how he did that because the biography was only privately published. Gail, did somebody named Van Newkirk ever contact you to get that story? So we have no idea how we ever learned of Jaylene.
And I'm also curious, did Charles Oldham ever contact you? Because he talks about you. Yeah. So you
Or
see,
unsolved mystery.
the story, you know, we're starting to look at this story differently now. But the question was, you know, Letty and the children. This was what fascinated me the most, was how did Letty get through this? All by herself, raising these children, very rarely seeing her husband. Can you imagine your husband just showing up once in a while for, you know, a month and having to kind of rearrange your life when he comes home? But Letty, you know, it was a tragedy and she was deeply, deeply affected by that. And I know that Gail's mother tells the story about how she sensed something was wrong. And before he was killed, the letters that he was writing to her for about a year, which had been quite lengthy for some time, started to get shorter and shorter, and almost like something was upsetting him. His language was changing. He seemed angrier. Something was going on. And it's not surprising to me that Gail's mother tells a story about how she had a sense that something was wrong. And that after the news came to her, that she just sat in the kitchen and cried for days. Yet there's another side to this. You know, Ed Rumill, she did go to sea with him when they were very first married. So she got to see some of the world with him. He exposed her to things that she wouldn't have seen otherwise, I don't think. And after he dies, she is free to make some new decisions, and her son ends up in school in Sonesville, and his teacher notices how incredibly bright he is and really encourages Letty to find new opportunities for her son. And she takes him and moves to Pittsfield, Maine, where Maine Central Academy is. And she finds, doesn't she, Gail, end up having a job like keeping house for somebody, or maybe maybe Linda, her sister, worked in a restaurant, I believe, so that this young man can have this education. And then eventually Edna, his youngest, also goes to school. And this opens up a whole new world for this family that would not have happened otherwise. George ends up following in his father's footsteps briefly, he actually ran away to sea at one point when he was a young man. I don't remember if this was before or after he started the University of Maine, but nobody knew where he was for a long time. And then they discovered he'd actually run away to sea, and ultimately becomes a pilot. And he's an aviation pioneer. And Edna goes to New York City to study theater, or was it Boston? I think it was actually New York City. She studies theater and opens and starts teaching theater. And Letty herself starts taking classes, adult education classes at the University of Maine. studying, I think it was ancient history and archaeology, something that she had a passion for. And so this is something that couldn't or probably would not have happened at that time. So I really would love to know more about Letty's story, and that how Ed opened a world for them. But it was Letty who really takes them into that world. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how old the children and Letty were when he was killed, because if he was
Yeah.
out for 30 years and was God's family.
And we'll understand that they, he started at sea before they were ever married. And also, they didn't have children right away either. But so the children were 10 and 5 or 10 and 7. 10 and 7. Was Edna 7? Was Edna 7? Or was she 5? They were young.
One was 9, I think,
Hmm.
and Uncle George was 3 years old.
Yeah, I thought it was 10 and 7 actually. But anyway, but they were younger. They were younger. Yes.
This is, I'm sorry,
No, you can.
this maybe Gail can answer. I live in Pretty Marsh, and the house that's on the corner of Indian Point Road and Bartlett's Landing, we've always called that the Heisem House, and I saw Edna Heisem. Did she marry a Heisem?
So yes, Edna married Gail's father, a Heisem.
Okay, so
Yes.
is that house, was the house that's on Bartlett's Landing Road? Was that your grandfather's house and Edna moved in, or did she move into that house with her husband?
No, when the couple was married, they began thinking house. And he advised her that there was a house that had been started in Pretty Marsh, in that corner, but it got lost to the bank.
Yes.
And her family house was just up the road. In fact, there was no woods there then, and you could see her home from the started spot in the ground. So that's why they bought it, but she and the children lived with her father. Her mother died. And until the house was built enough so that they could camp out of it. And little by little, she finished it off alone because by then we had passed.
It's my favorite house. I love that.
And Edna lived to be 100.
104 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And she was a font of information for local libraries and historical societies, and sort of passed it on to you. Yeah.
She was very interested in all of that.
Yeah.
Two questions that are not necessarily related. One, did the company that owned the ship, did they give the captain and any money? Or any of the other people any money? Did they get money? And were any bodies ever recovered?
No, the bodies were not recovered, other than Coakley's, who was the black sailor who was killed. So Ed Rumill had a life insurance policy. I think it was a $1,000 life insurance policy. So Letty had something. I do not believe that she got any money out of that. Now, the Berwind, of course, no longer belonged to the company. The Berwind went to the captain and crew of the vessel that salvaged the Berwind. It was a salvage. And this was all, according to Henry Scott, there was some thought that he was going to salvage the vessel himself. I think that's always questioned, whether that was actually part of the plan or not. That it was probably unlikely that that was actually one of the plans.
Gail, is there
I'm sorry.
memorial to your grandfather someplace? Is there a gravestone, a headstone?
There's a stone.
Yes, the
Yeah.
family has two
Yeah.
lots in the Berwind Marsh Cemetery.
Oh, really? Okay.
Tom?
It seems like the crew and the people that manage the crew are merely actors of capitalism gone mad, where they're trying to drive people into relationships that can't possibly work based on what they're asking them to squeeze out of minuscule dollars being paid. And it replays itself obviously throughout history. It's sheer madness to me. And the tragedy is what happens to the humans in question.
And it was a tragedy for every single one involved.
Reminds me a bit of trying to run a hospital. You know, I don't think you're too far off there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve?
A few questions. One, when they had the trial, was it in federal courts? Was it before a jury?
Yes, and that's so interesting. The trial is held in Wilmington,
Yes.
correct? Wilmington was the site of a major race riot in 1898. So this is a town that had essentially been taken over by white supremacists in 1898. And this was not a great environment for 3 Black men to go on trial. However, the fact that it was federal court is very important. Because of where this happened in federal waters, it ends up in federal court. And this is ultimately probably what saves these men. Is in fact, you know, and even despite the fact that the Supreme Court had not been kind to Black people as a rule at this time, it does end up working in their favor.
They were initially taken to the local jail, and there was some case to get them out of there because of the fear that they would be lynched.
Did the defendants testify?
Yes.
Yes, they did. They did. And this is interesting. This book is worth looking at because Charles Oldham is a lawyer. And he does look at this through the lawyer's lens. And he does talk about, they do have a white lawyer who's defending them. And he himself had connections to a white supremacist family. And so at first, you know, it's not clear that he's doing his best to defend them, but later, Charles Oldham does give him a lot of credit for being able to let go of that and really give them the best possible defense that he could have. They ended up in the right place, you know, Arthur Adams and Robert Sawyer at the right time. The justice system ended up working for them.
How long did they live? How old did they get, you know?
How long did they live
Yeah.
after that? We don't know for certain. When do we lose track of them?
We lose,
1919.
really the last that I'm aware is their employment by H.B. Warner and Joseph Bueller. Van Newkirk answers the same question. He says they're lost to history afterwards.
Yeah.
And any attempt to find them was unsuccessful.
No, and I have tried to look, and I am going to continue to look. It is possible. I did find a Henry Scott in Baltimore of the exact right age recently.
Yeah,
And they're following that. But as time goes, you know, more evidence will continue to surface about this. And I really would love to understand all of the stories. I really want to understand how Henry Scott came to this point where he felt that he had to kill a man. Charles Oldham it kind of looks at it from a psychological standpoint, and I'm not sure if we should be doing that. But he tries to tell the story also from that perspective. But I'd like to know, what does his, did their parents know? Did they have siblings who knew? How did this story affect them?
well, I'm getting the feeling that maybe it's time to wrap.
Yeah.
And let me just ask for any last questions or thoughts or comments that we should know about.
Was there a transcript of the trial?
Yes.
Yes, so thorough.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Do we know what order they were killed?
That's-
We do know the order that we.
The